Well, good evening. My name is David Domalski. It's been a joy to have been in this class this semester for my conversation partners assignment. I am doing Dever versus Clinton for the church, the gospel made visible, and then church planting threshold. So the first thing I noticed in an area that they might have disagreed in is the most important duty of the church. Mark Dever explains in a lot of chapters and a clear emphasis in his book is how the most important duty of the church is to gather, is to assemble. He highlights that in the Greek word ecclesia and how he repeats and emphasizes that as what the church is and what the church does. He even emphasizes that the duties of the church members are primarily towards other members and towards pastors. In reading Clifton's book, it seems like the most important duty of a church member and what the church is supposed to do is make disciples, who plant churches, who make disciples, who make churches. And in the very beginning of his book, in the intro, he makes a clear, emphatic statement that churches make disciples and disciples make churches. And so therefore, that's the most important duty of the church. Yes, we're supposed to model Christ-likeness and holiness to the outside world, to each other, respect pastors, be members, and all that stuff. But ultimately, it's all for the purpose of making disciples and then making churches. For me, I think I lean towards Clint in this one. I think that it's really important to gather together and to assemble, and that's definitely an emphatic declaration made in Scripture. But I think that if we're looking at the most important duty of the church, of a church member, and what a church is supposed to do, I think that assembling is a means to the end of making disciples. I don't think making disciples is a means to an end of assembling or gathering. And so I think making disciples is the most important duty of the church, from eldership to congregants to members and so forth. Another thing I noticed that was a bit different between them is just their view on eldership. They both talked about it and they both emphasized it, and I think they mostly agree on the importance of eldership and the process and that kind of stuff. But in Dever's writing, he seemed to really articulate eldership as really set apart, and he even said specifically that elders should be explicitly qualified, able to teach, preach. He kind of made that clear that the able to teach part is for the Sunday gathering, was a lot of what his writing was about the Sunday gathering, about that assembly. And they have a special obligation to reflect the character of Christ as elders. Clint definitely talked about that as well, and I don't think would have disagreed with that, but his emphasis on eldership was definitely more for the purpose of reproduction, multiplication, and I don't want to say that the bar was lower in his eyes, but as he wrote about it, he was saying, like, you need to be seeking out elders and picking a church planting partner and trying to preach elder qualifications so that members write names so that you can affirm them. Like, it was all about this should be an emphasis, and we should get more, and there are more there. We just have to disciple them unto it. Kind of like the emphasis on eldership, I think, for him was we should get more, and there are more there, and we need to emphasize it. I think Dever was more writing like elders are important, and they're explicitly qualified, and maybe the call for them should be really exclusive almost. And I think to categorize Clint's invitation would be maybe more inclusive. Although I think at the end of the day, they would probably agree on the qualifications ultimately. For me, I'm kind of a mix there. I think that they both bring up some good points. I think I lean, if I'm thinking about eldership in terms of being exclusive or inclusive, if we can call them that, I think I lean towards Clint in wanting to invite men in more often to consider eldership. Not that I want the bar to be set lower, but I do think that, at least in my experience, I see churches that are maybe eldership is not on their radar enough, and maybe the bar for eldership is maybe set by the pastor, and it's his bar of being able to do what he does, instead of, hey, maybe there are people in the congregation that don't work for the church that could still qualify as elders, and maybe we should affirm them. So in that sense, I think I lean towards Clint Clifton, if I have his understanding right, which I think I do, hopefully. Another thing that I noticed in their writing that made me think about their disagreement was Clint wrote about the process for a planter coming on board as elder, and he wrote early, this kind of goes back to eldership, but he wrote early about trying to get a church planting partner and having your sending church affirm them as elder, and the benefit that can bring. And I think that's good. But if we read Dever's work and his opinion on how even elders should be affirmed and chosen, it's definitely congregational led. He spends a lot of time talking about congregationalism as one of the marks. At the end, he kind of goes through the process of a church being, makes the case for a church being Protestant, and then one that gathers, and then congregational, and then Baptist. And so clearly his opinion would be elders need to be voted on and affirmed by the congregation primarily. I'd honestly be curious what he would have to say in a church planting context, because that's obviously what Clint is writing about. Like, hey, if we're planting churches, how do we really emphasize elders as we plant churches? And so maybe Dever would have something different to say in another book, but in his book about what makes the church, the gospel made visible, he clearly emphasizes that congregations and members affirm elders as elders. And Clint Clifton in his process for what he's proposing says, hey, you should, as an elder, get affirmed by your sending church, and if possible, get other elders affirmed by your sending church. And then maybe down the road you can have members vote on them. But the emphasis is definitely, let's get your sending church to, affirm these pastors before you plant. I think there's some alignment between them. In Dever's writing, he talks about how it's important for a church to have unity, not just over salvific things, but kind of down the line, secondary and tertiary things, just because it's helpful. And then when Clint was writing about getting a church planting partner, he advised, hey, you're going to want to have some synergy and alignment and unity as well. So I saw that kind of as something that they were aligned in. For me, I think that core teams should know the elders, but I think that the sending church can kind of affirm elders early on in the planting process before the church maybe even forms in the new location. And then I'd say, to kind of put Dever's suggestion in practice, would be, hey, if you're joining a core team, not launch team, core team, if you're joining a core team, why don't you use that vetting process for yourself as you apply to meet to meet all the elders that you can, and then in your joining of the core team, you're essentially affirming their eldership. I think it can maybe be synergized to work well with what they both suggest. Another highlight that I had, the fourth one I had, not so much a clear difference, but a clear omission by Dever. Clint, I keep wanting to say Clinton. Actually, I guess maybe his first name, Clint Clifton. He spends his whole last chapter talking about reproduction and multiplication, and it's a theme woven throughout. Church planting is multiplying and starting a new work of God, and his passion clearly that comes through in his writing. He wants the people of God to multiply and start new churches, Churches make disciples, and disciples make churches. So that's clearly an emphasis for him. Reproduction, even that church planting partner early on is for the purpose of starting a new work as soon as possible. That's just not really seen much in Dever describing the church. I wouldn't say he ever makes a point to say, hey, a clear mark of this church, and that's the fifth highlight, is those marks of a church. But even in general, he just doesn't really highlight multiplication much at all when talking about the church, what it does, what it should do, what it should be. Again, going back, the emphasis was more gathering, assembly, I just noticed that as an omission. He doesn't really highlight anything about multiplication there. I lean towards Clint. I think, knowing and reading some things about Mark Dever, I think he would really get behind multiplication and reproduction, but it wasn't in much of what he talked about with the church being the gospel made visible, is that multiplication, reproduction for the sake of the lost, that Clint clearly emphasizes, and I agree with. So lastly, that last highlight for me was those marks of a church. I think Mark Dever spent most of the book saying, hey, the marks of a church are the right preaching of God's word, the emphasis on that, and then the right application and administration of the ordinances, the Lord's Supper, and baptism. And then he kind of threw in at the end, hey, church discipline is actually the mark of a true church as well. For Clint, like that last highlight, I think for Clint, this one is more just a lack of talking about this. He didn't really say this is what a church is. These are the marks of a church at all. And he does mention later in the book, he mentions the ordinances and how to plan a worship service. And he leaves it really open-ended. He doesn't say, make sure you're doing baptism this way and the Lord's Supper this way, or even the Lord's Supper at all. He just kind of suggests, here are some things to think through. You should decide on these. Whereas Dever was like, if you're going to be a church, you have to rightly preach the word, which Clint agreed with. But you have to do baptism in a certain way, and you have to administer the Lord's Supper in a certain way. Clint just left that a lot more open-ended. I did think in their alignment and synergy, they had similar analogies for what the church looks like. Dever talked about those 4 images being the people, the new creation, the fellowship, and the body. And then Clint, kind of in not like a throwaway paragraph, but in a statement said, hey, the analogies or pictures that we have of the church are the church as the family, body, and bride. So those seem pretty similar to me in what, as they thought, what does the church look like? It seemed like they were aligned in that. But Dever was much more, like I said, the church is the right preaching, the right ordinances. Clint was like, as long as the church is making disciples, it should look like this. I think I err towards Dever there. I think that the church should look a certain way as it assembles, and it should really prioritize the right preaching and be aligned on the Lord's Supper and baptism. So there it is. Those are the 5 highlights. Enjoyed these books. Have enjoyed this class. So thanks.